So I think we can begin. I want to first, my name is Stephen Spodek. I'm a member of the Adath Israel. I also want to apologize. There was a bit of a confusion this afternoon where an earlier email went out saying that this event starts at 7:30, and below the notice, the flyer said 7, and in fact, the 7 o'clock start time was correct. So I want to apologize for that. I'm delighted that you're all here with us tonight. I'll start with a very short introduction because Professor Norm Ravvin has a lot to tell us and a lot to say. And today, Norm, I'll just begin very briefly that Professor Ravvin is an award-winning author and a professor at Concordia University here in Montreal. And I read earlier today that he's been described as a scholar with a patient eye and flowing prose. That's a wonderful calling card, if I have to say. And his previous work includes the novels The Girl Who Stole Everything, The Joyful Child, Lola by Night, and which I've learned recently was later translated into Serbian. And his earlier work includes his first novel, Café de Westin, and his travel log, Hidden Canada. Norm is here tonight to talk about his latest book, which was published in 2023 by the University of Regina Press. The title of the book is Who Gets In? An Immigration Story. The book tells the story of Norman's grandfather, Yehuda Yosef Eisenstein, and his account of Jewish immigration experience into Canada in the 1930s. Eisenstein was only granted entry into Canada by claiming that he was single, but in fact he was married and had children. I know that the book, and also in discussion with Norm, that the book required years of archival research, and it challenges the notion that Canada was a welcoming country. I think, frankly, personally speaking, having read half the book so far, that the book is so much more than Norm's grandfather's journey to Canada and his struggles, and I think that it resonates with themes that also resonate, that the realities of the times we live in, and the place we live in here in Montreal and in the province of Quebec. So I'll stop at that. I'd like to turn the floor over to Norm Ravvin. Norm, good evening.
Hi, Stephen, thanks. It's thanks to you that we're all meeting, and I'm glad to see you all, even the way we're doing it through small screens, and we'll have a good opportunity after I've finished to talk. So either, I think, send questions to Stephen, I think is
in the chat
is the plan that we have, and he'll attend to them. So I will share my screen in a second. I want the talk to be led by an array of photographs and documents. Most of those are in my book, and a few things that I'll show you are supportive. They're not in the book. They're not directly associated with the narrative. So I will disappear to some degree, but you'll still have the variety of your own faces, and then you'll have the materials kind of leading the way, and then I'll get out from behind them towards the end. And I want to read a little bit too, so 2 or 3 sections if we find we have time, to give you a sense of the sound of the book, the voice of the book. So here I go, and all should be well. You see my book cover? Yeah, good. Okay, so the story has a nice crossover between family narrative, personal narrative in my case, and the larger story of Canada, and in a very specific time period, maybe one that you know less about than a slightly later time period. So this is my maternal grandfather, Yehuda Yosef Eisenstein, really the key player in the book, and you see him in the 20s as an obviously Polonizing young man in his small place Radzanov. The reality is that he grew up in a very observant and Jewishly literate context, but he was following a trend among young people in Poland in that period to assimilate. And prior to the decision to leave and seek out a Canadian life, he was becoming a modern Pole. And part of that was time spent in the Polish army, and this is a studio photograph of him at the point at which he was an assistant to an officer in Warsaw. So for somebody who had come up in a entirely traditional context, this would have been a kind of a cosmopolitan opening for him. And I think I see pleasure on his face, and interest and forward looking. And you know, the idea of Poland in the post World War I period as a new nation, and people's youthful ideas of where that nation was leading were probably a part of his imagination. Um, he has a long engagement story, which I tell in the book, and it takes place in about 2 years before his decision to leave. And there you have the engagement photograph taken in a studio, which I was able to follow up on in a bigger place, not the little village, but a bigger place not so far from where he grew up, with his bride to be, my grandmother. And the other thing about this photo that is fun is the way that they're dressed. And my grandmother's very kind of stylish modern dress. And if you knew the kind of lives that they took up once they became older people, you would see that this was a kind of an unusual and unique part of their lives, the late 20s. So my grandfather leaves in late 1930, leaves behind this family. This photograph would become part of his activity when he was here in his efforts on all fronts to bring these three after him. And my understanding is this was taken after he left. My mom is the little one, her elder brother beside, in the same studio in Mlava. You know, different props, similar kind of scrim behind. And this photograph ended up playing a role in his efforts, though like so many details in my story, you're not exactly sure how impactful these different things are. So I'll just read you a short section in the early stages of the book, and I'll put him back on the screen because it's about him. Who is our young man? I might begin by calling him Z because of the Kafkaesque quality of his struggle, and then because in his efforts he was always the littlest of men, seemingly unaware of his vulnerability and lack of influence, at the end of a lineup of powerful players who, on a whim, could simply ignore or reject his requests. But also because Z he was to me, as in Zeta, though I knew him only in my first years and have no memory of him, not formed by other people's conversations or photographs. There's one snapshot of him from my childhood that I liked. He's seated holding me. I'm 2 years old, laughing open-mouthed in the way that 2-year-olds do. We're in a room that many years later I would know well, on Willow Street in Vancouver's Fairview Slopes, where Jews bought houses in the wartime. In the room with its paned east-facing windows, there were books, including a tall leather-bound set of the Talmud printed in 19th century Lemberg, a console record player which held hardcover folders of 78s. Some of them were popular records, but others were cantorial music, Kusevitsky and Rosenblatt. My grandfather put them on and sang along, facing the window. This sounds like ethnic melodrama, but that was Z, whose story now seems as timely as any as I could tell. There I agree with some of the things that Stephen said in his introduction. So here's a couple images of the place he leaves at the end of 1930. I call the village, stereotypically you could call it a shtetl. There's no need to really. There was about 1,000 Poles living here. 300 of them were Jews. A very typical kind of Polish setup in that period. This is a not so long ago taken sport photograph with the market in the center, no longer active, but of course, a very key economic aspect of the surround. All the houses around it were Jewish in the pre-Second World War period, and the little red brick peaked building in the front of the photograph is the still standing derelict synagogue building. So it's a place you can visit and still get some kind of, you know, pretty clear sense of the feel of the life there. Here's another overhead photo of the big basilica and houses, not the ones my family owned, but Jewish houses in the pre-World War II period. So once he's on his way, and this becomes an important part of what I have to tell, I enter what Stephen rightly, points toward as a kind of a broader picture of Canada. And I really try to hold to the 1930 to 1935 story. But some things are useful from 28, 29, but I don't let it ramble out too far. And any number of bureaucratic kind of documents are useful and revealing. And the one that he involves himself with as he leaves is this ship's return form, which if any of you have family who came to Pier 21 or to Quebec Port, you can access a course through the Pier 21 Museum. So he's the fourth line on the list. His name oddly transliterated there, Eisenstein. You've got the name of the person who sponsored him, that's key, place of birth. But then I just want to send your eye to the right-hand side, I think it is, at least on my screen, where someone started to cite his race or people as, starts with a P, Polish, and then they stopped. And they overrode it in handwritten writing, Hebrew. So here's a thing that signals what was going on in Canada at the time. And I have a short passage on this, which lots of you know about, has to do with the categories of accepted and desirable immigrants to this country. And rather than go into detail off the top of my head, I'll read you a little bit from the book in the early stages, and it hovers around this document about which there's a lot to say. So those from non-preferred countries could gain access to Canada officially only if they were farmers with means, farm laborers, domestic workers, or wives and minor children of Canadian residents. But railway and steamship agents, so here you have a steamship agent who went to work on this form, were told not to include Jewish applicants even in the non-preferred group, whether they met these labor expectations or held Polish, Romanian, or any other passport from the non-preferred countries of origin. Rather, Jews would be considered not by national status, but as requiring a special permit to be decided by the Department of Immigration on a case-by-case basis, and in many instances by an order in council. So here the period and its bureaucratic machinations come into focus. It's your first view of this kind of thing. I liken such immigration strategies to the dressing down that a military officer once received in a trial for treason, the breaking of a sword over a knee, or some other such demotion of a person's identity. Just so, my grandfather's nationality, his citizenship guaranteed by his passport, was replaced by a made-up, not understood category chosen by the federal bureaucracy, its immigration department, census takers, and transport clerks. He was branded on his way out to Canada with a scarlet H. So sometimes these kinds of, seemingly mundane or out of sight documents, they have an awful lot to reveal. So he goes first to Vancouver, where he has a young brother, and he parlays some training that he'd already done before leaving to become a shochet into further training in Vancouver. So he'd come over with the ability to shecht fowl, but in Vancouver he was trained to shecht cattle, tougher work. The guy who trained him, who I could tell you a bit about, told him he would do so if he would not stay in the city. So my grandfather, in many ways, as you follow his story, he makes decisions, he takes offers. They don't always have nice repercussions, but he follows them as he can. And he ended up picking up work at small Jewish communities, which were scattered all over the prairies. But in the case of Saskatchewan, you had Jews in almost every little place, if you can believe it. And I'll show you a little piece of that in a second. But he's very down low. No, he's very up high first. It's a bit blocked by my UR screen sharing, but if you look at the top center and see, this is not the name of the place that he was, Balcarres, was not far from there. And if you come all the way down to the bottom and see Roche Percé, as they might have said it in those days, he was at a place called Hirsch later on. So in these two places, he applied himself as a shochet, but he was also kind of an all-purpose religious functionary, teacher, married, buried, and ran the synagogues. So these are things he would not have done if his life had stayed in his birthplace. And he made his way here kind of on new front as a thing they call nowadays a ritual expert. He was a ritual expert. Here's just a quick look at a whole bunch of little places, and you can pick up Saskatchewan in many cases, although it's other places too. And the demographer Louis Rosenberg was keeping track of the census statistics of Jews living in these small places, 3, 4, 15, 24. So these are the kinds of places that my grandfather found work in. The first one, Dysart, the next one, Hirsch. Here's the train station he would have landed at when he came, well, in his case, he was coming from Vancouver. He was traveling east. These, remarkably kind of archetypal Canadian train stations stayed in place for a long time. And the community was small, but you can see from the number of grain elevators at Dysart when he arrived that the grain economy was strong. On the other hand, he arrived at the beginning of the Depression. So this is an element of cultural and political developments upon his arrival, which I never know how well he understood. But certainly the impact of the economic downturn on the prairies would have played a role. But he stayed employed throughout his period alone on the Saskatchewan prairies from late 31, 32 into 35. So he wrote out the Depression with his salary from those communities. Not far from the first place where he landed, there was a residential school, a very substantial early one called the File Hills Colony. And I try in the book to consider his proximity to what was going on in these places, because it was so important and transforming the Indigenous communities of his surrounding countryside. And one would expect the farmers would have understood these things. To some degree, might have explained it to him. And I was able to find, an article from Scientific American which talks about the vanishing Indian medicine man. Happens to be not very far from where he was in the early 30s. So I was kind of captured and fascinated by the idea that people were thinking of Indigenous medicine men as vanishing. And certainly my grandfather, upon arrival, took up his medicine and made his way as an all-purpose religious man in the prairies. So a kind of exchange, an unusual kind of a touch point. So a few things about this. I couldn't possibly have written the book or told the full story associated with my grandfather's efforts to bring his family after him to Canada if I hadn't found, after a lot of misfires, a couple of JIAS files, Jewish Immigration Aid Society files, all of them intact if you have a family like mine that came in the early 20th century. And in his case, the file was very substantial. There's lots missing from it. Sometimes there's answers to letters and not the ask. Often there's the ask. And he began writing first to the Jewish Immigration Aid Society in Winnipeg. So there's a story to tell there, and he's writing from his first place. He's always using a fountain pen. There's never much English except for the date at the top and the location. That was his custom. Choshev a Freund von Immigration, with an exclamation mark. Dear friend of the JIAS. He's getting started with his story at this point, and he's telling them what he's up against. So I show you a few of these. What had to happen, of course, was they had to be well translated. I can translate Yiddish typescript. I can't translate Yiddish handwriting. Though he has good, clear, kind of elegant handwriting, it beat me. But at the time I was working, I had the help of my uncle, who was his youngest son, and that man translated these for me wonderfully. And then would always provide a kind of a commentary, but so substantial. It was as if I had a collaborator as I worked on the book. So these are crucial to beginning to piece together who he starts to contact, in what way the Jayas contacts people further afield. They report back to him on these things. But then he goes out further and writes to other people too. And rarely enough, there is an envelope. Most of them are not kept. Someone in the office was taking the postage stamps, I think. And then we get some copies of letters as the process is ongoing. So this is later in the game, already in the spring of 34. But from this one, you get a sense of how he's operating. He's working with Jayas, but he's also got a lawyer. And this guy was called Wally Lind. He happened to be a kind of a conservative bagman in Estevan, Saskatchewan. He had good contacts in Regina, but he also had some correspondence with the Prime Minister of the time, R.B. Bennett. And exactly what role Lind played in my grandfather's efforts is not absolutely resolvable, but he was important. And in this case, you have a copy only of a letter written back to Lind telling him, sorry, I missed you in Ottawa. This is the federal immigration minister in Ottawa. Interested in your story of the rabbi and the wife and the family. And because he told the lie of being single, we've got a problem here, but we'll look into it for you. So parts of the file then are the response letters, which give you the sense of how the bureaucrats were getting involved. And I would say there's a very distinctive voice and reception by elected officials. So in this case, Gordon, the immigration minister, he's elected in Northern Ontario. He's a long-standing Conservative MP. And then there's the civil service, who you know about because many of you have read None is Too Many. Now, in our case, though, the None is Too Many context is not fully in play because the years of 30 to 35 are conservative years in Canada. And here's something that I add, or I supplement what you can get by reading None is Too Many, which is really about the period from 35 to 48 under William Lyon Mackenzie King. Different story. And you could say that my grandfather's outcome and operation and efforts and network were a distinctly other kind of network. Here, though, the civil service, which stays in place regardless of who's in government, is telling him to cut it out, and he gets a few of these letters that go to the Jayas and they fill him in on it. But we never hear from the bête noire of this period, F.C. Blair. He's not in our file at all. He's replaced by a fellow called A.L. Joliffe, who's an interesting character in his own right and does not want my grandfather to succeed. But the outcome is that provincial elected officials, federal elected officials are a different constituency. And my grandfather he's moving in the different directions that he can. So last few things to show you. Just quickly, one of the very detailed letters he gets back. This is most likely, well, no, this is addressed to him. So the Jayas are writing to him about what they're up to, and they don't tell him everything, but they keep him pretty well informed. Gives you a pretty good sense of how the bureaucracy worked, and also how little we know about the hardworking efforts of Jayas in this period. And any number of us have stories like this, where a big part of the effort was undertaken by the office on Saint Laurent in those days, but also there was an important office in Winnipeg. The other person who played a role in his outcome is Lillian Freeman, who some of you know about, and then others, if you read my book, you find out a lot more because she's an incredible player in the narrative, and not absolutely clear how crucial, but certainly crucial. And she was by all means the most influential non-elected Jew in this country in those years. And her full story is something that I work out in a couple chapters in the book. And she shows up, that's her house. Now it's the Canadian Army's Officers' Mess in Ottawa on Somerset. You can sneak up on it. And that's the interior looking a little bit like it did when she, sat at her desk and received the letter from my grandfather that said, hey, things aren't working out. And here's the note that was in our JIAS file. Last few things to say, and then I'll just read you something short. So he's playing all these different cards. JIAS is at work. He's got Lind talking to people. He's meeting with his provincial representative. That's a guy called Turnbull in Regina. Interesting character too, probably a Klansman. And then late in the game, he writes to Lillian Freeman, and there's a lot to tell, and it's fun how that came about. She writes back, "Dear Rabbi Eisenstein, I received your letter some time ago, but as I was ill for several weeks, wasn't able to do anything about your case. However, I have now taken steps to have it taken up at the Department of Immigration, and I hope they will be able to do something." There's a little bit more that I just haven't included here. So my narrative winds up some months after this, and the involvement of Freeman at this point is telling, and I work on different aspects of her activities, not only on our file, to try to convey what she was up to in this period. And so she's a crucial player in it all. Last few things, ultimately an order in council in our case. So we still do this in this country, but the Prime Minister's cabinet gets together and, quote, makes law or waives law or, quietly does a few things. And a lot of things happened this morning when they discussed a range of Jews getting access to the country when ostensibly our regulations said they shouldn't. So this is the record, and I spend a lot of time on it in the book, and that's another piece of the order in council. And then just the last thing, and then I'll pull away from the shared and read you one last thing. This is just a look at the way the translations looked as my uncle sent them my way, and there was a lot to translate. It took him over a few years, and just wonderful, clear translated text. And he was so Jewishly literate, he could always instruct me on things that were unusual in my grandfather's way of writing in Yiddish. And this is just an example of one of the commentaries that he follows up with. He's enclosing translations of letters. He says, things he knew, things he didn't know, and on he goes. So you get a sense of the collaborative work of the book. So there I should stop sharing and just read you one last thing, and hopefully hear lots of questions from you. So you could tell that I've got a substantial family story to work out. My family did not know it properly. It's a good instructive lesson on family lore. We had some elements of it. My grandfather, for reasons I can't explain, obviously did not fill his immediate family in fully on it, or he never really clarified in his own mind how all his efforts had the result that they did. So there's a quality of mystery about the things that we knew. We knew about Lillian Freeman, but we didn't really know any number of these other kinds of details. So my archival research was crucial, and my general kind of years of research and musing were too, and discussions with people over those years of research and writing. With my uncle, with my brother who lives in Vancouver, so it was all done mostly by correspondence, and a few others, but it was kind of a closed group in that way. And I was lucky, I would say, that I was really on different geographical ground, Saskatchewan, prairies, not the big city, that he had this particular institutional role that steadied him, protected him, and probably offered him some access. so that the range of networking that he was doing might reflect that. But he was also a letter writer of, remarkable prowess. And this too, when you look at other jazz files, you'll see that it's unusual to write letters as much and at as great length as he does. So he sets himself a kind of a high watermark in terms of the way that he approaches his challenge. But I think too, if you get to see the book, you'll sense that I take a different approach to the overall view of the Canadian monolith or the Canadian authorities that he was up against. And I don't exactly rehearse the character and the nature of anti-Semitism in Canada at the time, though it all comes clear. Rather, I kind of tell the story from the ground up to see or to try to convey how the individual fights it, puts their shoulder to the wheel. And I think a different perspective or a different view of Canada, specifically in those 5 years, 30 to 35, comes into view. So my grandfather is my lever, but Canada is my focus as well. So I'll just read you one short paragraph to finish. And it's quite, it's only not even halfway into the book, but it's my way of at different stages trying to say, okay, here's what I'm learning as I work my way through the family narrative and the national narrative. This is a Kafkaesque aspect of these Canadian decades rarely acknowledged. A system of authority, when called upon by an outsider to explain itself, cannot do so. Even more importantly, a system that seems to be an expression of total authority, cynical and unrelenting, is no such thing. It's always in danger of being undermined, some links weakened to the extent that the whole thing rattles apart. This is another point at which the none is too many rubric obscures the story that I have to tell. Even if he had heard of such a rule regarding Jews entering Canada from his homeland, my grandfather clearly did not heed it. So, Stephen, that's where I plan to stop. Let's see where Stephen is.
Thank you, Norm. I have a couple of questions and comments in the chat. I'll read them out, and other people should feel free to jump in. So someone asked about the name of the boat your grandfather came on.
The Ascania. The Ascania, yes.
And where did the boat originally land?
Okay, well, so every question's got a long answer. There were two Ascanias, and they were among this kind of, really fulsome fleet at the time of different steamship lines. And his Ascania generally was traveling from Southampton, but not always, sometimes from Hamburg. He left from Southampton. The Ascania would sometimes go to Halifax, but in his case, it went to Quebec City. So here's where, like so many of these narratives, you can actually never stop researching these things. So the steamship industry in that period was very built into the whole immigrant network, and they were selling the tickets back in the home countries. And they were also responsible to a degree to mount inspections before the immigrants got on board the ships, although the Canadians got involved in that too in later stages. And then you can go looking further and muse about what kind of cabin he was in, and I was able to do that. And also, this guy had always eaten kosher meat. What's going on? How does he eat across the way? So all these kinds of things show up in my interests. I don't let them go. So I'm not sure why the person was asking, but there would be hundreds of these names. And the Ascania was back and forth, Southampton and the Canadian eastern ports.
Well, this person mentioned that her father came over in June of 1930. So,
well, send me the name.
So the same person actually asked about when his family came over.
Okay, then I tell the end of the story, which you can see I've hesitated to do.
Right.
So, but okay, the listener asks, summer of 35. Summer of 35 is my end point. Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Now,
So go ahead,
sorry.
Steve. Sorry.
No, go on. I'm listening.
So you see in the note from Freeman that in the spring of 35, things are still not clear, though he's undertaken so much activity and effort. But there's something that happens in that early part of the year, and it's a number of the people and things that he's motivated start to move together. And then ultimately the thing resolves, and they have the permits, as they were calling them in those days, in the spring, and they have their steamship tickets for the summer. They're gone in a couple. The family uproots itself within a few months.
I have several other questions here, if other people want to write in, but Norm, if I could go through them. I guess one of the things somebody was wondering about, clearly you've put a tremendous amount of work and energy into the research you've done. What were your early motivations for beginning to work on this project? What prompted you, and what was your relationship like with your grandfather?
So there I had nothing because he was gone when I was 2.
Okay.
And I had a terrific relationship with his wife, my grandmother. So I knew things about Poland when I was in my teens, and heard about her hometown, the place where I show you the 2 photographs of the overhead view of, with great intimacy and interest from her. So she's really the motivating player. And sometimes when I give these talks, there's a nice question about her. So maybe it's yet to come. So she motivated things. Sitting at her kitchen table in Vancouver, I was patient. I would listen to everything 5 different times. And she was willing to tell them 5 different times. And my mom, too, in a low-key way, was interested in talking about her sense of her ancestral past. So that's the first thing I think of. It's a nice question, thanks. Then, of course, the thing I should say is that a lot of my writing in later years has been based on family stories, and I'm running out. And this was the last one that really showed itself as a kind of a problem. I couldn't have told it as I had it. I had it just too bare and in fragments. And I'd forgotten a lot of the stuff that I might have heard in earlier years. So then I started to embark on this effort to find some kind of archival material. It took a long time before I did. And then once I had those GIS files, the next step was translate them. And maybe they wouldn't have shown anything, interesting, but they did. So once the GIS files proved themselves to tell a very neat story, that's, I guess, where I said to myself, okay, this is on as a research project. But I really gave it its time, and I was in no rush. And I think that served the purposes of this kind of project, because it really, things fell into place in coincidental ways. I went back to the National Archives in Ottawa 3 times, because there were a lot of related documents in the immigration branch files and in the files of R.B. Bennett and other places that spoke to the stuff in my grandfather's GIS files. And this is the kind of archival work I've never done before. So I took that slow. And then COVID came and I couldn't get back there. So then I needed to wait for that to stop. And then I took one more trip back. And at that point, the 3rd National Archives visit seemed to say enough already. And I'd been writing along the way. And at that point, I took it on as a kind of a ready writing project. So that's a longish answer.
I have a comment here from someone. Her name is Valerie. and I'll read it out if I might. It says, "It's
Yeah.
fascinating and wonderful to look into your ancestry. Thankfully, there are records. I still can't get over the issues with Jewish people as much as I've seen and heard. I will just never get it. Thank you for this very enlightening
Oh,
story regarding Canada."
thanks.
So thank you
Well,
for that.
it's a timely, that way of putting it is, of course, attentive to the moment. Uh, and I have to say that in the years that I was working on the book, immigration was always in the air, and it remains so. And the headlines are not good lately. But for the first time since October 7th, the position of Jews is in the air. That's not something I've experienced in my lifetime, really. I've had it easy, you could say. So that comment seems to direct itself at that. And I'm with you.
So one of the other things, Norm, while you were speaking, I have to admit I used a bit of a, for lack of better words, a cheat sheet.
Uh-huh.
I was looking through the latter part of the book where you write quite a bit about Lillian Freeman,
Yes,
and she really sounds like an unsung hero
absolutely.
that needs that requires somebody to really speak much more publicly about her. So
It's so true, and there's no exaggeration there, and you have to say it even more extravagantly than that.
right,
And the odd person has started to pick her up as a research topic, but in very kind of particular academic contexts. And if you look on archives or websites associated with Jewish women of the 20th century, of course,
right,
she'll appear. But in terms of common knowledge of the range of her activities, and they were not simply directed at Jews, they were entirely ecumenical.
right. I saw
And,
that.
and the range of her influence, which conveys some kind of personal charismatic power that I can't say I could completely explain. So she's just a full story, really. And my two chapters get it going. And it's true that there's a great deal more to do on Freeman. Yeah.
Another thing that caught my eye in the part of the book that I read, and I was reminded of it this afternoon when I was looking at some notes, was I don't know if he was a public servant or he was a politician, but he also was living in Hirsch in Saskatchewan. And if I understand correctly, he maybe it's too strong of a word, he was somewhat sympathetic to your grandfather's cause. Is that right?
Yeah. So, I mean, he's fun. The person that you're mentioning ends up being the premier of Saskatchewan. And he's interesting because he comes up as an educator. So it gives you a sense of the type of person that got into politics in those days. They weren't all business people like R.B. Bennett. And this man was an educator. And in early years, lo and behold, he taught the kids English at Hirsch, Saskatchewan. So the place where my grandfather ended up as a teacher was something that he knew and appreciated. And also through his work as a school superintendent in Saskatchewan, he really appreciated the kind of ethnic checkerboard mix of schools and communities. So he's a great example, and I was really looking for them, of a Canadian authority figure. And he ends up for a short time the premier of the province. Who was open to ethnics, and he was interested in the ethnic character of his province, and he promoted it. Now he had some things, and I have some quotes from him where you can tell he has some things to say about Jews that we wish he wouldn't say. But
Right.
for the most part, his hand is open. So you're right, Stephen. In the range of correspondence, he's among the responders. He's also one of the people that I can't confirm if he played a role. He fades from the archival record, and I don't know where it went in the end. But my grandfather tried him.
How do you think your grandfather felt about telling a lie to get into Canada? And
Yeah,
do you think it sort of hung over his head afterwards?
yeah. So, the odd time I've given these talks, if someone in the room is themselves a recent immigrant or has a family immigration story that's contemporary or more or less recent, they relate to the lying. And they appreciate that there are these moves you make because for different reasons you expect or you hope they'll work. So I would say lying is it's a part of the ballpark of this kind of effort by people sometimes to get in, because if you're not coming with a bunch of money and an investment kind of context, then you're getting a close look. The thing I can say most concretely about my grandfather's sense of his having lied is that he never hid the lie in any of his correspondence as he got started. So it was as if he was viewing it as, all right, I played that hand. Now, how do we get beyond that hand? And he would often ask the Jayas people he's writing to, is there something more I need to do because I lied? The other thing that he was probably being told, and it was true at the time, so some in the audience may know of this, that there were lots of other men in the country who had done this and were trying to get their family in, the liars. And it went all the way up to a memorandum to an assistant immigration minister who then placed it on the desk of that immigration minister you had in the letter in my slideshow, saying, we got all these liars. They said they came as single and they're not. And now they're asking for their family to enter the country. So it seems, at least from what I could tell, that it was a specifically Jewish phenomenon because it was so hard for Jews, period, to get into Canada. So as far as how to maneuver this scenario, there was any number of men that took it up, and then any number who struggled. And that's an aspect of the late stages of the book where I try to investigate how my grandfather's outcome may have supplied some outcomes for other men who had done the same thing.
Question just came to my mind as you were speaking. I'm not a historian. I'm just an interested individual who appreciates these kinds of stories and these narratives of people's lives. But are you aware of any attempt ever to impose a head tax on Jews when they came to this country?
Great question. Such a good question. So they did it like gangbusters to the Chinese.
Correct.
Yeah, they tried things that I talk about in the early stages of the book on Punjabis, but it wasn't a head tax per se. Although there was a thing about their travel that required a certain amount in the pocket. That was the term they used. The Punjabis had to be carrying a certain amount of money. This was not applied to Jews. And you'd have to also say that there really never was a quota the way there was in the United States. That was the US way of going, and it continued into the Second World War, and they were always arguing about the quotas. But our regulations were kind of more free for all. And the Jews being placed in this special permit category was their scarlet mark. But the special permit category operated in a shadowy way, and it didn't have a head tax attached to it, and it didn't have a quota attached to it. So it's a one way. I hadn't thought of this. It's the way the Jewish treatment was unique. We were unique. Yeah.
Anybody have a question? I feel like I'm monopolizing this discussion.
It'd be great to hear anyone else's voice. And I'll let Stephen look at the chat. I won't fish there. I'll let somebody has a hand in the lower corner. It's Lila.
Lila, you have to unmute yourself. I can't do that. I think everybody has the ability to unmute themselves on the bottom of their computer screen.
Maybe I can do it. Let's see.
I think I'm here.
Excellent.
Terrific.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Yes. Yeah, we hear you.
Go ahead.
A lot of family in the Winnipeg area. My mother came in 1929. So it's a
Wow.
little earlier. But her next oldest brother, a few years later,
Yeah.
was in a little town called Imperial, Saskatchewan. When
Wow.
you say Regina and other cities, he had cousins and a lot of family in Saskatchewan.
Okay.
And my uncle was a grocery store. He was the general store keeper, but he was the teacher for bar mitzvah in the area.
Wow.
And cousins in Regina were very much connected. Saskatoon, I think it was, that heralded a few years later the Buchwalds, and one of the Buchwalds became the mayor, I believe, of Saskatoon, and then he came here to Ottawa working in Parliament.
Okay.
So they figured quite notably
Yeah.
in the community in Saskatchewan.
So you have a way of portraying it that I don't, because my grandfather was alone, but you're conveying the way the families, they were spread in these various little places, and then they would gradually also, land in the bigger places. And it's a nice way of conveying Jewish lives in that period, maybe in a way that people don't actually consider it for the prairies. Yeah, it's nicely
Well,
said.
The older sisters, three of them, who worked very hard in a factory in Winnipeg. They had emigrated earlier in the very early part of the 20s, and they made it possible for the younger part of the family to come.
Right.
It was originally the factory in Winnipeg of a cousin that heralded the family and supported them.
Okay.
But the spread was to Saskatchewan in surprising ways.
Right. Yeah, it's a bit like the Freeman story. That aspect of Canadian Jewish life in the 20s, 30s starts to change by the 40s. That's too little told too. We don't really know it that well.
And you can't say enough about Mrs. Freeman.
No.
And her charitable works and her big project,
Yes.
Little One Big Projects.
Oh yes. And I'll just add one anecdote, and maybe it's not the one you want to hear, but she was so she had access to both prime ministers. Bennett, she wasn't a close confidant of Bennett's, but she could chat with him when she wanted to. She was a close friend of William Lyon Mackenzie King.
Wow.
And she and her husband, so her husband had a big department store, but he himself was a kind of an organization activist at the same time. More common for the man to be that. In this case, both were. And both of them, Lillian and Archie, would go out and visit Mackenzie King at his Gatineau country house, have tea, talk about the war, talk about, I shouldn't say the war, talk about problems in Europe. And, that just begins to convey her direct access and then sort of range of influence, the comfortable relationship with Mackenzie King. That, of course, postdates my story. So I'm out of the range.
It all does.
Oh, I have a picture of my father in a uniform, the same as your grandfather's uniform.
They're beautiful, eh?
Yeah, the
looks
Polish
good.
Army, the Polish
Looks-
Army.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nicely done. Yeah. Other questions? Or chat? Stephen, you're muted now.
So someone is asking what in particular facilitated your mother's entrance to Canada?
Well, so the whole book is on that because she's of the three that he's struggling to bring.
Right.
And if what the question is aiming for is the final turn, it's the order in council, which I showed you too quickly at the end. And this is this interesting capability of the Privy Council, the cabinet of the Prime Minister, to sit privately and make laws, waive laws. And in that order in council in March of 35, the immigration minister tabled, among all the other things they were looking at, a list of about 25 Jews. It wasn't just my three, so my mom was included in the set. And he says, got good reason to bring all these in, and I sponsor this part of the ordering council, and assent. They agree to that. So I'm not sure if that's the trick that the question is looking for, but that's the final one. Then you receive the permits that busy you then arranging your travel. You have to get a steamship ticket and this kind of thing. Yeah.
There's something else that I'd like to ask. I'm not sure if it's relevant to this discussion, and you may have already alluded to it. Would it have been easier for your grandfather to completely bypass Canada and just go to the US?
So it's an interesting one. Yeah. So there's so much to say about that. So they had quotas. So things were working a little bit differently in the 20s and on into the turning point when he arrives in 1930. He did have family in the United States. So he had a couple siblings who had gone there. And then he had the brother in Victoria. So here I leave behind sort of the broader picture. It's more of a family-oriented story. And I don't know this for a fact, but I have a feeling the guy in Vancouver was more welcoming in that way that you sometimes hear in immigrant family stories, that they're not so excited to know that the next guy is going to show up and you might have to support him. So I think I can answer that fairly confidently, that the young brother in Vancouver was establishing himself well. He was sort of involved in the community. He was getting advice, from what I could tell, from Jayas people on the coast. And I think he probably gave my grandfather some of that advice that led to a few of the things that he did on the way to leaving. So that's my way of reading it. And you could say, so Stephen, it's such a, I also hadn't thought about it this way. So let's just say that the brother in the United States had been more thoughtful. Maybe that's how it would have gone. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it. And then Canada probably was not even on my grandfather's radar in any way, aside from the fact that the brother was in Vancouver. I think that's it.
So we're almost at the end. Someone actually made a comment early on. I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but what struck me was your grandfather's penmanship.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really amazing to see his penmanship.
Yeah, I won't risk resharing, but I mean, they're beautiful things, the letters.
They are. They're almost works of art. The calligraphy
this couldn't have hurt. I mean, and I have to say that that was so of all the things our family knew, my grandmother used to say, he had beautiful penmanship. So though she didn't necessarily understand the story really well, she got that if he wrote a letter, the thing looked beautiful. And I muse in the book about this because, of course, I don't know, where did he get his fountain pen? Where did he sit and write these letters? I think about how he mailed them. And then, of course, I'm so happy that the publisher was really willing and able to run a lot of illustrations so that you get a nice complement of them, so you can kind of take them in. Now, they lack the color and shades that you saw on the screen. My reproductions are black and white. Yeah.
Well, it's quite something. I'll ask one more, unless anybody else has a question or a comment.
Who's lurking?
Who's lurking? Yeah.
Anybody?
Well, my last question is, I was thinking about this as you were speaking, because, you know, did your grandfather learn to speak English?
Yeah. Yeah.
He did?
So these are my mom's parents. And my grandmother, whom I knew into my 20s, would be indicative. They never lost their Polish Yiddish accent. And Wednesday was always Wednesday, and you name it. But they didn't assimilate in the way that many did. And that's a story I don't tell in this book. but they maintained a Yiddish-speaking home, and their kids grew up Yiddish at home into the 1940s. And then off they went, two of the guys to university in English, and my mom off to work in English. But that aspect of their lives was a little bit unusual in that they retained these old world affiliations. But yes, certainly they both became English speakers with the heavy accent. Yeah.
All right. So before we close, it just made me think of my my late mother-in-law, who was a survivor. She came here with her husband after the war. She grew up in Krakow. I mean, a very different, needless to say, experience from your grandfather. But I was fascinated that she was a voracious reader. She read the classics in Polish.
Wow.
And she was once telling me how she read Anne of Green Gables in Polish.
Imagine. You know, Anne of Green Gables remains popular in Poland.
Does it?
Girls still read Anne of Green Gables in Polish. So she's an early example of that. Yeah.
Because when she told this to me, I had trouble believing it, but
No,
I guess it's...
Believe it.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to really thank everybody for joining us this evening.
Thanks.
And I apologize for the confusion about the start time, but we still had a very
okay.
nice turnout. And I really want to thank you, Norm,
My pleasure.
for doing this for us. It was wonderful and much
pleasure.
appreciated.
Yeah, hope I see you again sometime.
I hope so too, and it's given me some reason to go back to the book and finish the book now.
Thanks. Okay.
I wish everybody a very good evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for having me.